Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am here talking on behalf of Dr. Falendra Kumar Sudan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Jammu. I am going to talk about the module Population, Gender and Climate Change from Demography of Climate Adaptation. So students, we are going to discuss about the population dynamics, their interrelationships with climate change with a gender perspective. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time. Population and ecosystems around the globe are already facing the brunt of climate change. Climate change has threatened to set back development efforts by decades. However, the impacts are not being felt uniformly around the globe. Poor people around the globe will be mostly vulnerable to the negative effects of climate change. Majority of the world's poor are women. Women therefore represent the most vulnerable group. Women in many parts of the world still lack land ownership, reproductive healthcare education, and information. They still have poor access to formal financial systems and face unequal access to decision making. All this undermine the well-being of women as well as their families and communities as a whole. In addition, women are an untapped resource in efforts to cope with climate change and reduce the emissions that cause it. Women as innovators, organizers, leaders, educators, and caregivers are distinctly positioned to help reduce the damaging consequences of changing climate. To ensure that women contribute to and benefit from equitable climate solutions, it is important to incorporate into climate change policies, projects, and funds a gender perspective. This module has these objectives: to understand the dynamics of population, gender, and climate change, to analyze the consequences of climate change in gender perspective, to assess the gender perspective in adaptation plans, and to suggest the policy suggestions for gender mainstreaming in climate change context. Men and gender inequality. Women generally are not the only one who are affected by gender inequities and traditional roles. In most of the cases, men also directly suffer from their imposed gender roles. For instance, when Hurricane Mish hit Central America in 1998, more men than women died because of societal expectations that men should carry out high-risk rescue activities. Communities lost lives unnecessarily and will therefore take much longer to recover. Men have specific vulnerabilities linked to their socialized gender roles, traditional norms, and values, and the way in which prevailing ideas of masculinity are constructed that affect their health and safety. Around the world, women have made significant strides towards social equality and gaining rights. But even then, the socioeconomic status of women remains lower than men, which makes them disproportionately vulnerable to environmental changes. The poor and disadvantaged women, whether living in developed or developing countries, are unequally affected by natural disasters. They are overrepresented in death tolls. Moreover, this discrepancy in death rates mounts up with the strength of the disaster. Weather extremes and women. During natural disasters, women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men. About 1,40,000 people died in 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh. The mortality rate of women over 40 was 31%. More than 70% of the dead from the 2004 Asian tsunami were women. The 2005 Hurricane Katrina, which struck New Orleans, USA, primarily affected African American women who happened to be region's poorest, most marginalized community. Due to Cyclone Nargis, which hit the Ayeyarwady Delta in Myanmar in 2008, an estimated 87% of unmarried women and 100% of married women lost their main source of income. Population dynamics, gender, and climate change. By 2050, world population is projected to grow from the present 6.7 billion to between 8 and 10.5 billion. The major proportion of this growth is expected to be concentrated in urban and coastal population. The poor are already highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Population growth usually implies increased emissions. However, the emissions patterns and energy use is also affected by demographic factors such as household size, age structure of the population, and urbanization. Moreover, unsustainable pattern of consumption and per capita emissions are generally much higher in rich and industrialized countries. Thus, it shows that population is not just about numbers, rather it's about people. The policies primarily affecting population trends such as more educational opportunities for girls, greater economic opportunities for women, and expanded access to reproductive health and family planning can be helpful in reducing the vulnerability to climate change impacts, slowing the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, and ensuring adequate energy and sustainable development for all. The consequences of climate change. Climate change impacts on women are numerous. For developing effective gender sensitive policies and programs, an understanding of the interconnection between climate change, sustainable development, and population issues is important. Hence, first of all, discuss the catalysts of change. Women play a paramount role in managing, conserving, and using natural resources in many parts of the world. Women are primarily responsible for growing food and collecting water and fuel wood. This has made them aware of their environment and the overwhelming effects of deforestation, desertification, and other forms of environmental degradation. Women can well become the agents of change through mitigation, management, and adaptive activities in their households, workplaces, communities, and countries. Women are taken as victims of climate change and natural disasters. Not only this, within their communities, women can be proved to be efficient leaders in addressing the harmful effects of climate change. Women's involvement in devising early warning systems and reconstruction efforts has largely helped communities in managing better when natural disaster hits. Women's efforts must be integrated into climate change policies, and the same should be endorsed through capacity building. Women can also be leading the way. In Mali, 90% of energy source is through burning wood and charcoal. Rural women in Mali have developed sustainable alternatives to the wood trade. Excessive dependence on wood for fuel has resulted in extensive deforestation and desertification, which in turn has led to subsequent soil erosion and erratic flooding. All this adversely affects agriculture and infrastructure. In order to reduce dependence on wood and controlling resulting deforestation, a project has been initiated to educate women about alternative livelihood activities. It is also engaging rural women in micro-lending programs, literacy, and training. Since the implementation of the project in 2001, 80% of the women have stopped or significantly reduced wood usage. Women have taught their families about preservation of the environment. In addition, with their increased income, women are now able to send their children to school. Women are also the environmental managers. The people in the Pintadas district of Brazil depend primarily on agriculture for their livelihoods, but undependable irrigation system and water scarcity has made it difficult to tackle poverty. In order to tackle these problems, a collaborative partnership of organizations developed a small-scale irrigation project. This project has been piloted by South-North Network. The project was intended to educate women and men about better water management and irrigation techniques and exploiting solar power. Through Pintadas Women Association, a woman was selected to lead the initiative in changing the face of decision making. Now, women are empowered with technical know-how so that they can manage and adapt new agricultural systems. Now people in Pintadas are able to deal with climate change and drought. Moreover, food security, water management, and income generation have also improved in this district. Women against environmental destruction. In India, a women-led environmental movement, namely the Sholi Gram Samaj Mandal, has been successfully protecting and managing the environment for past 4 decades. Women in rural areas are heavily dependent on the local forest for water, fodder, and firewood, all of which are threatened by climate change and natural disasters. Considering natural resource conservation as a matter for community concern, the women shoulder men as partners. Women's involvement resulted in extensive reforestation, reduced damage from floods and landslides, and less women drudgery. In this movement, women has effectively demonstrated their leadership abilities and helped in improving the sustainability of their environment, which has challenged government policies and traditional assumptions about gender roles. Equality in climate change policy. Gender equality has been broadly identified as a precondition for sustainable development and as central to global initiatives such as Millennium Development Goals. But in spite of this wide recognition, a gender perspective is missing from climate change policy. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, is the overall framework for intergovernmental efforts to address the challenges posed by climate change. In the critical negotiations under UNFCCC, many parties and gender advocates alike are striving to include gender perspective in the new global commitments, funds, and projects. The decision-making and implementation of policies and programs at both national and local levels should respond to vulnerabilities and exploit the potentials of both women and men. The challenging and costly adaptation should be prevented through commitments to mitigation. Adaptation activities should be prioritized, particularly for vulnerable communities, including women, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities and indigenous people. Investments in mitigation and adaptation should be increased. At the same time, these should be based on gender analysis. Investments in voluntary family planning and reproductive health access will help in empowering women, lowering fertility rates, improving maternal and child health, and slowing population growth. All of these will help in mitigating climate change and creating more resilient, adaptive communities. National Adaptation Program of Action, that is NAPA, and climate policies should incorporate gender and population issues to effectively meet the goals. Now we can discuss about the policy that supports gender equality. It is well established that women and men are affected differently by climate change. The government across the globe need to consider this differential impact while developing policies to reduce emissions and cope with the impacts of climate change. The policies that consider the particular needs and capacities of both women and men are more likely to be effective. IPCC, in its fourth assessment report of 2007, confirmed climate change impacts will vary depending on gender, age, and class, with the poor most likely to suffer. Due to gender inequalities, women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable. Majority of world's poor are women. They are generally responsible for household food production, family health and nutrition, and management of natural resources, the sectors that are particularly sensitive to climate change. However, women are not merely victims, they are also agents of change and have unique knowledge and capabilities. To ensure inclusion of gender perspective in climate change policies, it is important to solicit and encourage their leadership to address climate change and inform, without which climate policies could be ineffective. Supporting the human rights. The 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, that is ICPD Program of Action, acknowledged advancing gender equality, eliminating violence against women, and ensuring women's ability to control their fertility as the cornerstones of population and development policies. As such, it remains an extremely relevant framework when considering climate change policies. Thus, in the mitigation and adaptation measures, it should ensure that ICPD principles, including a human rights based approach to reproductive health and rights rather than a focus on demographic targets, remain at the center of climate change and population policies. Population issues, human rights, sustainable development, climate change, and disaster planning are addressed in various international agreements and mechanisms. They together provide a framework of rights and commitments that support the incorporation of gender perspective in national climate change policies and legislation. Designing and implementing policies in a complementary fashion increases their efficacy as well as their funding potential. The precise linkage between sustainable development and the rights of all people and communities has direct implications for climate change related risks and paves the way for full participation of women in all aspects of action to tackle them. Now let us have a look upon national policy mechanisms. The international framework is used by national governments to craft their own climate change policy. Integration into existing development strategies, along with additional financial support, is the key to success. By addressing inequities, building resilience, and lowering long term development costs, adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk management with a gender perspective will help fighting poverty and injustice. There are four mechanisms for national action. National Adaptation Programs of Action, that is NAPAs. NAPAs are the medium for least developed countries to recognize, prioritize, and fund their most urgent climate change adaptation needs through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The guidelines state that NAPAs should recognize the fact that some climate change impacts are gender specific and should be participatory and involve both women and men at grassroots level. In spite of this recognition, the incorporation of gender and reproductive health issues into NAPAs has been weak in practice. The second one is poverty reduction strategy. Poverty reduction strategies, or PRS, is a process designed to be a country-driven and participatory. It makes countries eligible for debt relief under the HIPC, that is Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative for lending from the World Bank and IMF. But it is held that PRS process lacks clear institutional framework for participation of civil society, which ultimately has led to the exclusion of women, indigenous groups, and rural communities. Although it provides an opportunity to integrate climate change action into country strategies via the PRS papers, fewer countries have done so. The third one is national communications. National communications are necessary for parties to the UNFCCC. National communications quantify greenhouse gas emissions, assess vulnerabilities, and report on the national situation. Thus, they can help all governments in identifying where to integrate gender issues into climate change actions and policies. In compliance of common but differentiated responsibilities, developed countries must specify policies and measures in place. This would make the communication a potential medium to showcase the integration of climate change with gender and population issues in these countries. The fourth one are national mitigation plans. National mitigation plans to achieve reduction in greenhouse gas emissions should involve activities which address sustainable development priorities and situations of each developing country. Mitigation plans can incorporate agriculture, sustainable forestry, and resource use. These indirectly affect women's livelihoods and thus can help in improving agriculture productivity as well as resilience to climate change impact and can contribute to food security, sustainable development, and adaptation. Now it is important that we should be making NAPAs work for women. Countries across the globe are awakening to the idea that coping with climate change requires a rapid response for avoiding worst consequences. Developing world is expected to hit hardest by its negative consequences, where it is already undermining development gains. Majority of the poor are women. They are primarily responsible for caretaking of families and experiencing adverse effects of increased natural disasters and changes in their environment. National Adaptation Programs of Action, that is NAPAs. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, in response to the current realities of climate change, started the process of National Adaptation Program of Action, that is NAPAs, to assist countries already stressed with and most at risk from climate change impacts. The most important function of the UNFCCC is to facilitate countries' reduction of greenhouse gases, which is primary contributor to climate change. However, the adaptation needs of the least developed countries are equally urgent. Any kind of delay in reaction could significantly increase LDC's vulnerability as well as the future costs of taking action. NAPAs were the mechanisms by which LDCs assess their urgent climate change adaptation needs and prioritize actions to meet them. NAPAs contain a list of ranked priority adaptation activities and projects with short profile of each to help in the development of proposals for implementation. NAPA activities help the communities most susceptible to the effects of changing climate. It is therefore important that gender inequalities are addressed and women's priorities and concerns are included in the NAPAs. This will help LDCs to keep their development efforts on track. It can also help them in dealing climate change impacts effectively and efficiently. NAPA Preparation Guidelines. The guidelines for NAPA preparation put together by the LDC expert group assert that the process should be participatory. The national level team should consist of a lead agency and representatives of stakeholders, including government agencies and civil society. People at the grassroots level should be included as they can give information on existing coping strategies. People at the grassroots level are also the most affected by climate change. Their involvement can ensure potential benefits for them from NAPA activities. In view of the fact that climate change affects women and men differentially and in most cases affects disproportionately women, the guidelines also emphasize the importance of gender equality. Now the question is how NAPAs are funded. The NAPA preparation and implementation is mainly funded by the Least Developed Countries Fund, that is LDCF of the UNFCCC, which is administered by Global Environment Facility or GEF. The bulk of the funds are reserved for project implementation. The LDCs, after submitting a completed NAPA to the UNFCCC Secretariat, are eligible for and will receive equal access to implementation funding. Now we can analyze gender perspective in adaptation plans. As recognized by NAPA guidelines, a number of climate change impacts are gender specific and overall its effects are greater on women than men. Climate change is expected to make the tasks of growing and preparing food, collecting fuel and water, and providing care to the sick in the family and community more burdensome. Demands on women's already limited time will increase. Moreover, increased number of school-going girls may be pulled out to help. In addition, women's lack of property rights and control over natural resources means that they have fewer choices when it comes to adaptation. Women's life expectancy is significantly reduced by natural disasters. Women are also made more vulnerable by their lack of involvement in disaster prevention and preparedness programs. At the same time, women are often prepared to take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change as a means of risk aversion and resiliency building. Women play an important role in managing natural resources. They are, as noted by many NAPAs, the repositories of traditional knowledge on sustainable practices and coping strategies. If they are provided with required information and skill, they can prove to be effective innovators and leaders in climate change adaptation and mitigation at the community level. Collective action is needed to meet growing challenges such as water scarcity and seasonal droughts. Without women's participation, adaptation plans and programs simply will not work. Women's participation should be ensured from initial consultations through all levels of decision making and implementation. It should also ensure that their knowledge is utilized and that projects establish realistic goals. The policy suggestions. All multilateral climate financing mechanisms should be reviewed to assess their ability in mobilizing and allocating funds to those most impacted by climate change and disaster. Innovative, non-debt creating multilateral financing mechanisms, such as a single global climate change fund, should be developed. Negotiations on a global North-South deal on climate finance should be done on basis of no climate justice without gender justice. All efforts should be made to mainstream a gender perspective in all financial mechanisms and instruments associated with climate change at all stages, including design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. At national and international levels, gender budgets and gender accounting for climate change projects and programs should be implemented. Financing mechanisms with guidelines, targets, capacity building, and technology transfer should be encouraged that support sustainable forest practices in developing countries and make provisions for vulnerable populations and participatory decision making, including for women. Climate change adaptation and mitigation financing should be situated within the broader context of development financing and development goals. Disaggregated socioeconomic data should be collected to ensure funds to meet targets. Developed countries should apply the principle of polluter pays and common but differentiated, but by extending compensatory and reparative finance to developing countries to fund climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. Developed countries should commit to strong regulatory emissions reduction targets rather than voluntary market-based initiatives, generally excluding the poor. Developed countries should assist developing countries to build eco-friendly and gender-sensitive adaptation and mitigation policies and programs and engage in the same at home. The external debts of poor countries should be cancelled by developed countries to free up resources for mitigation and adaptation. So students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. Developing countries should make climate financing policies and resource allocations responsive to people's needs. Developing countries, by following a participatory approach, should ensure equal access to climate change financing by women. Foreign and domestic investments should be directed towards mitigation and adaptation through the provision of subsidies and incentives, particularly in areas with strong gender equality and poverty reduction impacts such as agriculture. UNFCCC should engage in a systematic progress of gender mainstreaming and invest in specialized research on gender and climate change. It should utilize disaggregated indicators to observe the impact of adaptation and mitigation funds and conduct gender review of all funding mechanisms. UNFCCC should also ensure mitigation strategies, fund new green technologies, and develop and implicit necessary GHG emissions regulations. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.